A single laser beam, no wider than a coin, travels from a ship's mast to a target moving at 300 miles an hour. It makes contact in under a second. The drone falls into the sea. Cost of that shot, roughly $1 of electricity. For the first time in the modern missile era, the United States Navy is fielding a weapon with no magazine to empty and no missile to count. So how does a warship actually become a laser platform? How do you wire 60-plus kilowatts of directed energy into a hull built for guided missiles? Directive 1 traces it, stage by stage, from raw electrical power to the moment the beam leaves the ship. The reason this happened when it did starts with a shift in the threat. Through the 2010s, the Navy's planners watched the price of attack drones collapse. By the early 2020s, adversaries were fielding swarms of small unmanned aircraft that cost a few $100s each. The standard defense, a RIM 116 rolling airframe missile, runs several $100,000 per shot by public estimates. A standard missile 2 costs over $2 million by some estimates. Shooting down a $300 drone with a multi-million-dollar missile is not a sustainable equation. The Navy needed a weapon whose cost per shot approached zero. That is the engineering mandate behind HELIOS, the high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system. The first operational unit was installed aboard the USS Preble, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in 2022. Rated output, over 60 kilowatts. To picture that, 60 household microwaves running simultaneously, focused to a point the size of a thumbnail at range. At that intensity, it burns through a drone's fuselage skin or melts a control surface in seconds. Here is what most people picture wrong. They imagine a single tube aimed at the sky. The real system is closer to a power plant with an optical output. It starts deep in the hull. An Arleigh Burke destroyer runs on 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbine engines, each producing roughly 33,000 shaft horsepower. In normal operation, they turn the propeller shafts. For the laser, the ship draws from its separate ship service power system, 3 gas turbine generators feeding the electrical bus at roughly 4 megawatts total electrical capacity. Running the 60 kilowatt class HELIOS unit draws a small fraction of that, manageable without slowing the ship. The several hundred kilowatt class system being developed for the DDG-X next generation destroyer will require dedicated power management and a much larger generation margin, which is a principal reason the Navy's new destroyer design is sometimes described not as a missile ship, but as a floating power grid. The power coming off the generators is not clean enough to feed a precision laser directly. It goes through a power conditioning unit that smooths voltage fluctuations to within fractions of a percent, then into a capacitor bank. The capacitor bank does what the turbine alone cannot. It delivers current in a controlled, stable surge, absorbing any spike before it reaches the laser modules. Think of it as a shock absorber between a combustion engine and a surgical instrument. The laser itself is not one beam from one source. HELIOS uses a fiber laser array, dozens of individual fiber-optic modules, each producing a narrow infrared beam at a wavelength of around 1 micron. Individually, each module puts out a few kilowatts. The engineering trick is beam combination. The outputs are routed through a combining optic that merges them into one coherent beam with far less divergence than any single fiber could produce at that power level. The combined beam exits the system at 60-plus kilowatts. At the several hundred kilowatt scale now under development, the number of fiber modules scales up proportionally. The principle is the same. The thermal and alignment challenges multiply. Waste heat is the hardest part. Every kilowatt of laser output generates roughly 1.5 to 2 kilowatts of heat inside the laser head. By some estimates, current fiber lasers convert energy at around 30 to 40% efficiency. At 60 kilowatts output, the system is producing well over 100 kilowatts of thermal waste continuously. That heat has to go somewhere or the laser degrades within seconds. The solution is a closed-loop liquid cooling circuit. Deionized water runs through channels machined into the laser modules, absorbs the heat, carries it to a heat exchanger mounted at the hull below the waterline, and dumps it into the ocean. The sea is the ultimate heat sink. At 60 kilowatts, the seawater return is warm but not dramatic. At megawatt scale, that thermal load becomes a genuine ship design constraint. The beam director sits on the mast. It is a gimbal-mounted optical turret, a mirror assembly inside a protective housing that can slew fast enough to track a target, crossing the field of view at hundreds of miles an hour. The mirror surface is polished to nanometer tolerances. Ocean spray, salt haze, and vibration from the hull's own machinery are constant problems. The mount uses active vibration isolation. Accelerometers on the turret sense micro-movements and drive counter-actuators to cancel them before the beam wanders off target. Without that system, a drone 2 kilometers out would see a laser spot walking across its fuselage rather than holding steady on one point. What's most surprising about the atmospheric challenge isn't the range, it's what the air itself does to the beam. At high power, the laser heats the air column along its path. Heated air has a lower refractive index. The beam begins to self-defocus, spreading before it reaches the target, a phenomenon called thermal blooming. The countermeasure is adaptive optics, a deformable mirror upstream of the beam director that changes shape hundreds of times per second, pre-distorting the outgoing beam so that the atmosphere's distortion cancels it out by the time it arrives. The sensor feeding that mirror is a separate low-power laser aimed at the same path, measuring the wavefront error in real time and sending corrections back in milliseconds. The fire control system ties it together. A phased array radar, the SPY-1D already aboard the Burke, tracks the incoming target and hands off a track file to the laser's own electro-optical sensor suite. The EO sensor refines the track to millimeter precision. The beam director slews to intercept. Dwell time, the period the beam holds on one spot of the target, is typically a few seconds for a small drone. Long enough to burn through a carbon fiber fuselage or sever a control wire. The system can engage multiple targets sequentially, limited only by slew time between them. The honest constraint: fog, heavy rain, and dense smoke all scatter infrared at this wavelength and reduce effective range significantly. The laser is not a replacement for the full missile magazine. The Navy's stated intent is layered defense. The laser handles the close swarm, the missiles handle the long-range ballistic threat. Every drone the laser stops is a missile saved for something the laser cannot reach. The next step is the several hundred kilowatt class. Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman are both under contract for variants. At that power level, effective range against larger targets extends substantially and engagement times shorten. After that, the Navy's roadmap points toward megawatt-class systems capable of engaging cruise missiles. Those require a ship whose electrical plant is designed around the laser from the keel up, not retrofitted around a 1980s destroyer hull. What this comes down to is a change in the economic logic of naval combat. The weapon that fires is cheaper than the weapon it destroys, in many cases by a factor of 10,000. If that asymmetry scales, it restructures how fleets are sized, how they are supplied, and how long they can stay on station. For the first time in the modern missile era, the limiting factor is electricity, not ordnance. Which megabuild should Directive 1 take apart next? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments.